Stationary Engines 97 was filmed by the Old Glory crew at a variety of locations around the country during 1996. Amongst the many fascinating places we visited was Nigel McBurney's home base, where an excellent collection of engines was revealed.
When I was a youngster, I had a O-gauge steam railway, and that really probably kicked me off onto being interested in mechanical things. And of course, Meccano set was my favourite toy. Later on, when I left school, I was an apprentice scientific instrument maker. My interest in vintage started at a very early age. I lived next door to Mr. Seward of Petersfield, who had 3 steam engines, and I helped them with those when I was a youngster, 10 or 11, back in the 50s, one of the early preservationists. During my apprenticeship, I got interested in motorcycles and got away from preservation or old things. I then always had this hankering to build a model traction engine, and I started back in the late 60s. But it was very, very slow business building an engine, half-scale auction. And when I got married, I think my wife was, wanted to see something moving. And we went round to we used to go to 1-2 rallies, and a friend of mine from motorcycling days used to collect stationary engines, and my wife said to me, why don't we buy one of those? So we went to a sale back in 1974 and bought a Lister D, £7. And that's how it started, and it's really become a way of life now. We even moved house to get a bigger site, to have a bigger shed and be able to restore everything. My favourite engine is the 5-horse Blackstone. It's a beautiful engine. It's my oldest engine. It's the only engine I've got which is built in the last century. It runs well, beautiful engine. It was built on 14th of November 1899, number 21961, and it's believed to be the oldest surviving Blackstone engine. Definitely the number is the earliest known number. It powered a carpenter's and wheelwright's shop in Huntingdon, owned by Mr. Murphy, until 1976. And then it was bought by Mr. Crossley, who did a lot of the restoration, but it was converted to magneto ignition sometime back while it was working. Obviously, insurance companies in timber yards didn't like open flames. So when I got it, it was painted. It was still running with a magneto and a crude vaporizer and a 4T carburetor. And my first approach was get it on a decent base and then convert it back to the original. I was very fortunate that 2 collectors in the country both owned one of these Blackstones, and one kindly lent me the castings and the other one explained how it worked. There was only about 10 surviving, 8 or 10 surviving, one in Australia and the rest in the UK. It was a follow-on from the Carters of Billingshurst's original design, which they sold the rights to Blackstones, and they moved up there with them, two of the Carter brothers. The Blackstone engine is just a development of their original Reliance engine. If you see the two together, you can they are got a lot of common features. The fuel is stored in the base tank. It's a paraffin. And very often those days, if you see, they called it petroleum. Petroleum oil was in fact what we know as paraffin or kerosene. The fuel is pumped by a metering pump to the top of the vaporizer. And it's sucked on the induction stroke. The fuel is sucked through the vaporizer and into the inlet valve. All in one motion. The pump and the inlet valve are opened on by the camshaft, and it's an instantaneous vaporization and suction. It is a very rich mixture which goes into the cylinder. An additional air is drawn into a valve on the side of the cylinder. This prevents the fuel, which is very rich, being drawn in and igniting immediately. The fuel vapor, very heavy vapor, mixes with the air in the cylinder, goes back under compression, and the hot tube ignites it. The only snag is there's no timing to it, and if the hot tube gets too hot, you get a violent pre-ignition. So the temperature of the tube has to be regulated. You can't let it get too hot. Governing is by a hit and miss system. The ball governors lift a lever which engages with the pair of levers which operate the fuel pump and the inlet valve. When it's running light, it usually misses 2 or 3 strokes and then catches again. Obviously, as the load would go on an engine, it would hit and miss less and then eventually fire as a normal 4-stroke. This small Blackstone is a 3 horsepower made approximately 1910, serial number 86,397. It's a Type W hot bulb oil engine. It's a later development. It's where the hot bulb needs, you warm it up and then the lamp comes away. The earlier Blackstone needed a continuous lamp. That was a sort of a plus for the later hot bulb engines. It's the most notable feature of this engine is the straight spoke flywheel. At the moment we know of 3 engines with this feature, and some of the early Blackstone catalogues show a few engines with straight spoke flywheels. The majority of Blackstones had the lovely curved spoke flywheels. This development of the Blackstone, its main difference is the vaporizer. This vaporizer you only need to warm with a blow lamp until it starts, let the lamp run a little longer and then turn the lamp out. The pump is a constant pump, just to, it's like a carburetor, brings the fuel up to a level to a jet, and the induction stroke of the engine sucks the fuel through the vaporizer and then compresses it. The extra air again is drawn direct into the cylinder, but the firing, this time they've tried to time the firing because to prevent any pre-ignition by a timing valve on between the vaporizer and the cylinder. It's a flat valve, like a carburetor flat valve, and it's operated off the camshaft. Whether it was totally successful or not is debatable. Some engines will run without it, you can hold it, and this particular engine is very critical. It won't run unless the valve's set absolutely spot on. The governing system is another Carter's patent. It's all internal. It is a hit and miss governing again, but it's a bob weight and a catch inside the governor. It's just the advantage was it's tied in. It was just hidden away, and to make it reliable and keep it clean. Very little is known about this engine. I purchased it at a sale 3 years ago. It was believed to have driven a water pump or a dynamo. I've heard 2 versions of this, so I'm not really certain. These Blackstones, as I've got them, the 2, they're not continuous running engines. You have to stop them every so often for lubrication. The big end requires the big end oiler to be filled up, so they run for a morning and then stop. They're not a continuous day and night engine. My Hornsby is a 3.5 horsepower Type L hot bulb oil engine. It's what they call the 1912 version, which was the last update. Its most notable feature is the so-called saucepan lid governor. The governor is vertical with a cover over it. It tidies it up. Probably a more sensitive governor than the early ball governors, though not probably such an attractive feature. It's a hot bulb system. It's very similar to the original Hornsby Ackroyd. It's injected. It's not a high pressure injection like a diesel. It's a low pressure system, which is the injection is on the induction stroke. So the fuel is injected into the hot bulb. It cooks during the induction. where extra air is drawn into the cylinder, and then the air compresses, and with the cooked fuel mixture in the hot bulb, as it compresses, it causes it to fire. It's not a diesel engine. A lot of people get confused. They think it's a sort of a semi-diesel. The fuel has been in there for some time, it's cooked, and then it fires. It's quite a low compression device, but very, very reliable. That was its main feature of the Hornsby engine, was its utter reliability. Very, very well built. I mean, Hornsby's are superb engineers. My particular engine was built in about 1918, and it was sold, according to Ruston's records, in 1919 as a Ruston Hornsby, because Ruston's had amalgamated with Hornsby's in November 1918, just after the First World War. So it's still got the Hornsby brass plate on it, but technically it was sold as a Ruston Hornsby. The Crossley KK oil engine actually belongs to my wife. She bought this about 3 years ago because she quite liked it. We saw it in the magazine. We saw it advertised in the Stationary Engine magazine, and we drove off down to Cornwall and bought it. She liked it and said, "I'm going to have it." It's 3 horsepower, built in October 1910. It runs on kerosene, and it's a hot tube engine. You see it running in my today. I've got a continuous burner on the hot tube. If it was working under load in a nice little warm engine shed, the blow lamp could be taken away. But I found for rally purposes, I've made a different cover for the hot tube, and with a small propane blow lamp just to keep it warm. It won't run light at a rally for very long without a lamp. But it's one of those things, it was not meant to run on a rally field without a load, but there it is. So I've got round it by keeping just a gentle heat on it. So this engine was bought from another collector. I repainted it, altered the cooling arrangement, built a new trolley for it, but I didn't do the very basic restoration. Crossley's, which is one of our oldest internal combustion engine manufacturers, by this time had developed this range of oil and gas engines. The designation on these engines, a single letter K indicates the size and is a gas engine. When they use a double letters KK, it means it's an oil engine. This really was the last of their hot tube come vaporizer engines. They soon went on to a range of 4-stroke engines with spark ignition. I've got this particular engine. It's got the so-called short base, where the bed plate is only a shallow depth, and it requires to be put on a secondary block to keep the flywheel up in the air or away from the floor. Invariably, they're meant for, if they're mounted for industrial purpose, they'd be mounted on a concrete block. The other style is the full base, where the cast base extends down as far as the flywheels. After the First World War, Crossley's found a need to develop a range of engines which are spark ignition, more modern, more powerful, probably more reliable. And they come up with this range of, they call their new small engine, which are readily identifiable by the twin side shafts, a very distinguishing feature, because I can't think of another engine with twin side shafts, or another maker engine with twin side shafts. This particular engine it's got a little history to it. It was exhibited on stands 40 and 41 at the 1921 York show by their local agent, and then it went to a garage in Holyhead, and Crossley's must have been doing a part exchange or buying it, because they then said they put it as resold to another customer in Sussex. So obviously doing a part exchange scheme. After it was sent to a customer in Sussex, no further history. But I bought this engine through 20 odd years ago through an advert in the Exchange in Mark. Funny enough, it was only a mile up the road, and It was a little bit funny. I went to buy it and did a deal with the chap, and he turned around and he said, "Oh, I don't really want to sell it." And I thought this was funny after even agreeing a price and seeing it run. And apparently, by the time he put the advert in the paper, he was having a job move and it didn't really come off. And about 2 months later, a friend of mine said, "That Crossley you're after, get up there quick, the chap wants to sell it." So I was up there like a flash that evening, trailer, and brought it home quick before he could change his mind again. This engine was funny enough, it was running. It was rusty, dirty, but it was a good runner. And it is a superb running engine, very, very quiet. The feature which I mentioned, the twin side shafts on this Crossley, the lower shaft is the normal camshaft which runs at half speed. It drives the exhaust and inlet valves. The upper shaft runs at engine speed. The idea is that it can drive the governor. The higher speed you drive the governor, the more sensitive it is, and because it can be lighter. And also it drives the magneto faster, which gives a more reliable spark to get better starting. This particular engine, you've got advance and retard on the Hills magneto, which was original. But this engine, the small engines, these frames, you can start them on full advance. The larger engines, you have to be very careful, they will kick back violently. This particular engine is designated a PP 1060, which is about 2 3/4 horsepower. The PP stands for petrol paraffin. It's on par with the quality of a Ruston IP, a good steady running engine, run day and night, ideal for generating and driving machine shop or small machine shop. The only American-made engine is which was shown of these 6 engines, is the American Fairbanks Morse. This 1.5 horsepower engine, the Fairbanks Jack of all trades, was a real low-cost engine imported into this country in the early 1900s, and it soon proved severe competition, particularly to Petters, and one of the reasons why Petters produced their cheaper handyman, because Fairbanks were selling so well. This particular model was produced from 1900 to 1906 and can be easily identified because it has dual ignition. Besides the electric igniter type ignition, low tension ignition, it has also a hot tube and a petrol blow lamp. The petrol blow lamp is not a pressurised one as we know it. It's a petrol burner where it's supplied from a container which, as the book says, must be placed 6 foot above the base of the engine, and which provides a slight head. I've never tried it. I don't fancy having a barbecue on the rally field. A petrol blow lamp seems a little bit dangerous. I have seen photos of one in America where somebody had converted one to propane, but so far I've not tried it. I've tended to run on the electric ignition. Originally, these engines would have had a battery and low tension igniter, but Fairbanks around 1910 offered a conversion set of a magneto and the crankcase door bracket, which was modified for all their engines, so you could update, because I think people were fed up with dry batteries, because apparently the American farmers were great ones for pinching the batteries from the telephones and putting on their engine, and when that ran out they had neither telephone nor engine. This engine I bought from a dealer, no history known, but it is known to be what I call original import, imported at the turn of the century, not a recent import from the States. Out of my collection now of 22 engines, there's about 10 are restored, and it's time. I like to do a complete and thorough restoration. I don't like to rush the jobs. Currently I'm doing a small National F-type, and I'm also working on the large portable, which 10 horse Hornsby portable, which I bought from the Absalom sale. But that has an awful lot of metal to clean up, and it's coming along very slowly. Ambitions, I like the really well-built open crank engines. I've just bought a National, which is a very nice engine, very well built. I tend to not so much go for rarity. I like the the well-engineered engines. I suppose everybody's dream in the stationary engine world is to find a slide valve ignition Crossley, but you need to win the lottery to get one of those nowadays. And a lot of those have disappeared to the States. So probably have to keep my ambitions a bit lower than that.
Occasionally, engines of a very rare nature are spotted out on the rally circuit. This engine was seen on show at the Banbury event.
This International Harvester engine is a 4 horsepower Mogul. The Mogul engines were made from about 1908 right through to 1917. This particular one was supplied in 1916. It is complete as it was supplied on the factory-made skids with a thermosiphon cooling system. The water, when it reaches boiling temperature, by thermosiphon moves to the top of the tank, where it runs down a screen, cooling the water back into the tank to go back through the engine. This means that the engine can be adequately cooled using the smallest amount of water possible. International Harvesters always made top quality engines, and this is one of their best engines, being a side shaft engine, built to run on kerosene. It started on petrol. As soon as the engine is warm enough, it is turned straight over to kerosene using quite a large carburettor. That is a very prominent feature on top of the engine. It has a low tension ignition system driven off of the side shaft with a provision to retard the spark to starting the engine. There's also a very interesting slider arrangement to bring in the small cam to relieve the compression when starting the engine. This particular engine has been with the same owner for the last 25 years. It was pulled from its original place of work by this owner and taken in part exchange from the debt. It's the first time this engine has appeared on the rally field, and it is in totally original form.
"1996 gave us a second chance to visit Cumbrian collector Arnold Sayer and examine a few more of his cherished engines.
The first engine we're looking at is the Galloway engine. This engine was manufactured by William Galloway and Company of Waterloo, Iowa in 1918. It is a 6 horsepower portable on its original trolley. An interesting feature is the clutch pulley, which allows the engine to be started with its load disconnected. When the hand wheel is pulled out, it releases a clutch mechanism inside the pulley, which allows it to freewheel. After the engine is started, the hand wheel is pushed in, which closes the internal clutch, allowing the engine to take up its load. I bought this engine off a fellow collector in Scotland in unrestored condition. Mechanically it was pretty good, slight frost damage. At some time it had a catastrophe with the governor mechanism, and most of the governor parts had been welded or repaired. Some of these I replaced and some I just got welded. Basically, other than that, it was in good condition. The National Gas Engine Company of Ashton-under-Lyne was founded in 1889. Shortly afterwards, they brought out their first model, which they made until the late 1890s. As far as I know, this engine is one of 2 survivors of this model. The engine is a 4-stroke 3-valve engine. The air and exhaust valves are operated mechanically by cams driven from the side shaft. The gas valve is operated by an inertia governor. This governor is simply a wedge-shaped piece of metal which is moved up and down while operating the gas valve. When the engine speeds up, the weight tips slightly and misses the valve stem, shutting off the gas supply. The main bearings and big end are lubricated by wick oilers. The piston and cylinder are lubricated by a mechanical oiler, which is belt driven from the side shaft. As the oiler spindle is revolved, a piece of wire dips into the oil reservoir, and then the oil the wire picks up is wiped off and drips into a small well which feeds a pipe leading to the piston and cylinder. I bought the engine off another collector. It was in pretty good condition when I got it. Basically all I have done is mount it on a 4-wheel trolley. Drake and Fletcher of Maidstone, Kent, started making engines in 1898. They only made their own engines until about 1919. After this, they bought in other makes to drive their pumps and sprayer units. As this engine has a very low serial number, 67, it was probably made in 1898. Drake and Fletcher were best known for the manufacture of water pumps and orchard sprayers, which they still make to this day. For many years, I thought this was the only surviving Drake and Fletcher engine. However, very recently, I have heard of another one in Australia. So as far as I know, there are only 2 survivors. The engine is rated at 2 horsepower, originally ran on coal gas. It now runs on propane. It is a 3-valve engine. The air inlet valve is operated by the suction of the piston. The exhaust valve is operated by a long hinged lever under the engine, which is operated by a separate camshaft. The gas valve is operated by the swinging inertia governor, which moves backwards and forwards along the side of the engine. When the engine speeds up, the governor lever tips slightly and misses the gas valve stem. The ignition is by hot tube, which is heated by a Bunsen burner fed by a separate gas supply. When I got the engine about 10 years ago, I wrote to Drake and Fletcher telling them I got it, and I think they were very dubious as to whether I really had one, because they thought they'd all gone many years ago. However, when I got the engine restored and running, I sent them photographs, and they've since wrote back, very interested in it, and if I ever want to sell it, they want to buy it, they tell me. Andrews started making engines in 1878. The earlier models they made were two-stroke with a charging cylinder at the rear, which made them look like a post-piston engines. Shortly after the expiry of the Otto patents in 1890, Andrews started manufacturing a four-stroke engine. My engine is one of these early Andrews engines. It was installed at Messrs Fairless of Corbridge in 1892 and spent its full working life there. When the engine was removed from the joiner's shop, the original delivery note was discovered, dated 5th of May 1892. Andrews were eventually taken over by Richard Hornsby and Son in 1905. Again, I bought this engine off a fellow collector. It was unrestored and at some time had been converted to magneto ignition with a sparking plug screwed in where the hot tube had been. I was fortunate enough to find an engine very similar at Anson Museum at Poynton, and they kindly lent me the missing parts, basically the hot tube chimney and the hot tube adjusting assembly, and I had them copied, accurately copied, so I was able to put the engine back to its original condition. I think of all the engines in my collection, I think this is my favourite.
Also resident in the northwest corner of England, we found this rare and aged portable engine from America.
Abenaki engines were built from 1895 to about 1915. Production then went on to tractors. Abenakis were a small engine manufacturer. They didn't actually produce too many engines, mainly perhaps one or two per week. And what they tended to do was they reconditioned engines. When an engine was sent out, when it was new, it would work a few years, it would come back into the factory and be reconditioned and sent out again. You can find some Abenakis with two sets of engine numbers, one on the nameplate and one on the cylinder head. And if you date the engines, you'll find one tends to be 5 or 6 years older than the other date. And out of total production, there might have been 150, 200 engines produced, but there could have been a lot more engines actually reconditioned. The Abenaki engine of 1895 was quite a crude design. Engine production in America around 1895 was some years behind the engine production in Europe. In Britain, for example, we've been producing engines for possibly 20 years before the Americans, before Abenaki Engine Works started producing engines. And Abenakis have one or two rather unusual American features. Star wheel ignition, leaf springs for valve springs, fuel injection into the inlet manifold, which is quite a modern idea on quite an old-fashioned engine. The governing system on an Abenaki is volume governed on the hit and miss principle, and the engine actually governs on the exhaust, on the inlet, on the fuel pump and on the star wheel ignition. So basically every part of the engine is governed. feature of Abenaki engines was star wheel ignition. Rather than the usual low tension ignition system, we have a star wheel in the combustion chamber with a wire projecting through the combustion chamber that touches onto the star wheel. As the star wheel rotates, like so, the wire is flicked off the star wheel, producing a spark. Another unusual feature of Abenaki engines is a cooling system. Rather than one large tank behind the engine, you have two thin parallel tanks with a large surface area to provide better cooling. So you can actually cool the engine off 4 gallons of water, whereas a British engine possibly, you perhaps use 50 gallons of water to cool the engine. I bought the engine from a photograph. I'd never really heard of Abenakis. I had a look in the big Wendell yellow book. It's the first engine in the book. I thought it was rather an unusual engine with the unusual cooling system, and had the engine shipped into the country, and basically I found it in a box all in bits, which was rather a daunting task. Abenakis are quite a uncommon engine. There's only 3 in England that I know of, and there's not a lot in America survive. I don't know the exact figure, but if you go to a show over there, you'll be lucky to see 1 at a show, never mind 3.
Before making its annual pilgrimage to the Great Dorset Steam Fair, the Old Glory film crew dropped in on the South Coast-based Barnes family to see their collection of well-restored engines.
We basically got interested in engines in 1972. We found an old engine, an old Lister D, on a farm in the Fairbanks. Found it in a dilapidated state, brought it home, started to strip it down, rebuild it. So my father helped me restore this engine back up together, and my brother got involved when he got a bit older, and we do it now as a family team. We take the engines around various shows around the country, Manchester, Great Dorset Steam Fair. We've got a few engines. We also like doing things as we've done years ago, letting the engines do what they used to do, like driving mills, sawing, driving generators, and you may see us at the Great Dorset Steam Fair doing this. The Tangye hot bulb 2-stroke Model M is a hot bulb engine which runs on a diesel or a paraffin fuel. It is rated at 2.5 horsepower at 650 RPM. It will run both ways because of the cam mechanism. They weren't very successful in making these engines. They didn't last for a long period of time because the spark ignition engine, I think, was a lot easier to handle, and they were a bit on the dirty side. It's driving a water pump, which used to be a reservoir pumping water up to a tank, which then fed a house or maybe a group of houses so that they had water rather than you know, going out to the well. So it's sort of like a luxury thing to do. I got the engine from Sherborne, and it was in a rough state when we got it, and we completely restripped it. One of the sides of the block was badly frosted. We had to replace like the side of the block and rebuild it all back up again. There's various bits of the pump missing. We had to do that, and the injector pump, we had to rebuild that. And as you can see, it's all up together now, and it runs quite nicely, and it's quite a nice economical unit. The ignition system is a hot bulb. You have to put a blow lamp on it to heat the combustion chamber up to allow the combustion to get to a temperature that the fuel that you're going to inject in it will expand. It's done by a low pressure injector which works off of a cam that is on the crankshaft, which is driven by the flywheel, which is a concentric cam but also on a taper. So as the eccentric of the cam pushes the pump, the taper then goes towards the flywheel, and it then reduces the amount of throw on the fuel pump. Therefore it's reducing the amount of fuel that is actually being pushed through the injector. Therefore it is slowing the engine down. The reed valves work much the same as normal two-stroke engines do. It's got two reed valves on there on the crankcase. One side is fitted with a reed valve, which the oil from the oil bottle is sucked off of the seat of the reed valve, and this thus lubricates the big end and the piston and the small end. The main bearings are oiled by a man of a ring oiler. It's quite simple, it's quite economical if it's not driving anything really hard. The water pump is a single cylinder water pump. It can pump to quite high pressures, but the main reason for the pump being geared down the way it is and the slowness of it moving is it can pump a lot of water for a very tall height. I think it's quoted in the brochure that this pump will push a 2-inch pipe full of water 250 foot, which is quite a weight of water to push, and it will keep carrying on and doing that all day long. They probably had a water pump sat near a reservoir, start it up in the morning and let it run all day to fill the tank up, and then when the tank's filled up, this will then last for a few days, and then the engine would stop if it run out of fuel or somebody actually stopped it. This is a Tangye 4-horse. It's just a big brother of the 2.5 horse as explained earlier. It works in exactly the same manner, except for that it's a bigger piston, bigger crank, more throw on the stroke, and they made the engines in 2.5 horsepower, 4 horsepower and 6. I've not yet seen a 6 horsepower pumping set. I've seen 6 horsepower engines but no pumps, so I really would like to see if we could find a 6 horsepower to put like the 3 sets together. The pump is that much bigger again. It is got a 3-inch inlet and a 3-inch outlet, so therefore it can pump a lot more water. And again, the brochure again says that it will pump 250 feet of water at 3 inches bore for a period of all day, filling the tank up. They're all mounted on cast bases in exactly the same manner as each other, and the bases are all pinned so that everything stays together. Another little interesting item is that the gear wheel is made of a wooden fibre rather than metal, and it's got steel rings on the outside. This is done in this way to make the pump a lot quieter. Rather than metal to metal onto the gear wheels, it's got a wooden like fibre gear wheel to make them a lot quieter. The Tangye 4-horse I managed to get this. I was rallying the Tangye 2.5 horse pumping set, and this lady come along and said I had a Tangye like that in the shed at home. I went round to have a look at it, and there was the engine stood all on its own with no pump on it. I asked her, I said to her, it's a shame really that you didn't have the pump. So she said, well, there's still some of it left down the bottom of the garden. So we went down the bottom of the garden, and therefore we found the pump set up on the cast base. This engine's a Tangye CV. It is rated at 5 horsepower. It is a petrol paraffin hit and miss governing type engine. This is quite unusual, having a hit and miss petrol paraffin. The only other engine manufacturer I know that does it is a Victoria. This one is different as it doesn't have a carburettor or fuel mixing system. It's much similar to the Tangye hot bulbs, where they actually put the tank higher than the inlet valve, and they let the fuel dribble down onto the seat of the inlet valve and then go through their air chamber that way. And as you can see, the spark plug is screwed into very similar to what the hot bulb combustion chamber is on a Tangye hot bulb engine. I thought at first that it had been an engine that had been converted to magneto, but it's got the engine number on the magneto, and having found out from a few other people that they did make these engines, and they made them from 3 horsepower up to 8 horsepower. This one is actually a 5, and it runs on paraffin. They did make them that they're throttle governed. The only difference with this was that they strangled the inlet valve, so the inlet valve would not come off of its seat, therefore not letting fuel into the actual air chamber where it mixes the fuel, and they called this a throttle engine. This one here is a hit and miss, which has a set of flyball governors, which works exactly the same as what a Pinkley system does on their previous hot bulb engines of about the early 1900s. Tangyes were noted as well for not balancing any of their engines. I believe they didn't balance the engines until they got to 17 horsepower. This one hasn't got any counterbalance weights, so it runs a bit on the erratic side if you take it up too fast on the speed, because there's no balance weights on the crankshaft nor on the flywheel. Tangyes thought that they didn't need it because it should be bolted down firm enough on a foundation, and their engines were strongly engineered to cope with this. And but as you can see, it's running slowly, so therefore the balance doesn't go out that much.
This engine is a Hornsby 6 horsepower with a 6 1/4 inch bore and 12 inch stroke. It is the hot bulb design where you warm it up before you actually start it. The engine was actually sold to West Sussex Water Company, and it used to drive a 3-cylinder Perrin water pump. The engine was actually installed by the builder of the actual building, and he actually bought the engine in 1927, although the actual date of manufacture is between 1918 and 1919. The engine itself runs a side shaft, which then drives a stirrup pump, which then runs the fuel into an injector, which works on fairly low pressure, not like the modern diesels. The fuel is then injected onto the hot bulb on the internal, giving it the combustion it needs to fire. The governing of the engine is done by ball weights. Actually underneath the silver cover you can see turning round and round. As the engine increases in speed, these fly out, causing the long arm to move downwards and depress the valve you see with the funnel underneath. when the engine reaches a required speed, the valve depresses and the fuel, instead of going through the injector, then goes back into the funnel and then back into the fuel tank for further use. But the engine was actually bought by some friends of ours and restored by the pair of them back in about 1990. Unfortunately, one of them hurt his back and couldn't actually rally the engine, so we bought it off him and then stripped it down and repainted it and mounted it on the chassis that it is on now. And hopefully in the future we'll restore the Pern pump to actually go with it as well. This is a JEH Andrew engine. This is the oldest one in our collection. Been 1896, 100 years old now. We acquired it 2 years ago when we sold a Ferguson tractor, and when the man came to pick the Ferguson tractor up, he saw our other engines and said he had a steam engine the same. Curved brake flywheels with a sort of like funny shaped base, but it didn't have a spark plug. So after talking to the engine and find out what it was, we went up to just before Dartmouth Tunnel to pick it up. Very rusty condition and completely seized. After getting it home, we left it for a year soaking in diesel. It has a bore of 6 1/4, the same as the Hornsby, and has 11-inch stroke, and it is rated at 5 horsepower. It has many unusual features, such as the oiler working off a belt system with just a wire dripping into the oil, wiping across a bar, and then dripping down a tube to the actual piston. The big end is worked on a system where oil is in a cup and there's a tapered pin in a hole, and as the crank goes round, the rod rises up, lets the oil go in, and then drops back down using like a pump system to pump the oil actually around the big end. But the engine also employs a side shaft system the same as the Hornsby, but has an unusual difference. It has 3 valves. Being a gas vent engine and running on hot tube ignition instead of a spark plug, it has a constant flame to the tube to keep it warm, to keep the ignition to fire. The 2 cams are for the inlet and the exhaust, and the 3rd cam operating the gas valve, which operates just after the inlet valve is opened, to give it enough gas then to fire off on the hot tube. The governing system is on the gas valve and uses a large weight on a pendulum type system. As the engine increases in speed, the weight swings away, causing the pecker to operate the gas valve to fall away from the actual gas valve. As the engine slows down, the pecker weight is heavier, so it actually presses against the gas valve, making it operate to give it the gas it needs for the next fire.
As well as the large Andrew of 5 horsepower, we also have a 1.5 horsepower, which is size C. It was acquired about 3 years ago by swapping a Armley open crank engine, and the engine belonged to Charles Hudson from Sussex, and he was quite willing to do a straight swap between the Armley and the Andrew. The difference between the small size C Andrew and the 5 horse Andrew is that the 5 horse has got 3 cams. It's got a cam for the exhaust, inlet, and for the gas. That one has only got one for the exhaust, and the same cam is used for the inlet valve and for the gas valve. It is a 4-inch bore and a 7-inch stroke. Runs on gas. The other difference to it is that there is no balance on the flywheels as there is on the 5 horse, which means that it does not run too fast, otherwise it shakes pretty well. There's only 2 holding down bolts to fix it to the concrete base, of which they normally were done. It runs quite nicely. It's quite economical. I should never think it was used in farm work. I should thought it had been used in factory work, because being a gas engine, they wouldn't have had gas taped into farm buildings, and but factories, yes, I should think that's where it came from. It was supplied on the 31st of July 1899 to a firm called Robinson's in London.
Finally, whilst at the Netley Marsh Steam Engine Rally in July, this Fairbanks engine took the eye.
This engine is a Fairbanks Morse. It's a ZA type, 1920. I've had the engine for approximately 4 to 5 years now. Originally I bought it as a donor engine for another one of the identical type, but we never did have any luck with the other engine, and in the end this engine was rebuilt from most of the parts from the two. The engine has an American Bosch impulse magneto. The American Bosch magneto on these was only used for 2 to 3 years. I'm not sure the exact years, but I don't think it was used very much after 1920. It's American Bosch because after the First World War, of course, you couldn't have Bosch being a German make. So the Americans, I think it's something to do with they made it American Bosch to get around that problem. Sorry, throttle governed. The governor is on the right-hand side below the magneto. Is atmospheric inlet valve and mechanically operated exhaust valve.